relying on vernal pools in Appalachian Virginia. But in other regions, they can be facultative species, breeding in other environments, such as wetlands. In Virginia, they're under threat from wetlands development, but a few populations hold on. In fact, I mentioned the pipeline. Before that project was killed, the route of the pipeline, its access road, was going to go within 500 feet of one of these ponds, very close to here. While tiger salamanders are common in some parts of the country, the eastern species can be scarce in some states. And in Virginia, they're considered to be state endangered. Ambystoma tigrinum are the largest of the mole salamanders. They cut a pretty impressive figure with their bright speckled eyes and mottled patterns, and their muscular, strongly keeled tail. Most eastern tiger salamanders in Virginia are coastal, but there's a tiny relict population in Augusta County, real close to Waynesboro, and it's part of an ancient group that dates back to the Pleistocene. Another salamander, Jefferson salamanders, emerge in the early spring from their forest refuges and travel to vernal pools for their own breeding events. My friend and fellow photographer, Dave Huth, contributed this fantastic locomotion study to our vernal pools ebook. Here you can see a comparison between Jefferson and spotted salamander. Note the plain grayish coloration of the Jefferson versus some of the spotted salamanders you see on the top left. I find their toes so alien looking. Females lay their eggs in oblong clusters, often attached to stems below the surface of the vernal pools. With careful periodic observation, you can watch the embryos develop in successive stages through the transparent egg capsules. This is an ultra-macro image of a Jefferson salamander embryo in one of its stages of development. And then shown at the same scale, a spotted salamander, which is the egg on the left, shows a much larger capsular chamber surrounding the embryo when compared with the Jefferson salamander egg. Another example of studying the details when you actually get your photographs back, helping you understand ID and the kind of differentiation that's here. The embryos continue to develop, and eventually the larvae emerge, this time distinguished by their bright golden eyes and mottled tails. February through April, so again, we're right there, is spotted salamander season in Virginia. With their iconic polka-dotted skins, spotted salamanders are really emblematic of the vernal pool world. Here's a close-up of one underwater during a breeding event in Augusta County. I love their smiles. During these breeding events, males deposit what are called spermatophores, these kind of popcorn-looking things you see here that contain their genetic material. So these are on the bottoms of the pools, and females will go in and pick them up. Here's an ultra-macro image. You can see the structure of one of those spermatophores. And over on the far left is a tiny copepod next to it. It's probably about 1 millimeter high. Female spotted salamanders deposit their eggs in these kind of luminous clusters below the surface of the water. This was actually a really exciting moment for me to observe. My wife is in the audience, Anna Maria, and she was out with me that night, and she'd tell you I was pretty much jumping up and down for joy because I had wanted to document this very moment, and I could see it from the edge of the shore, and I realized I had just a few seconds to make the image. So just as an aside, I actually practice in my home office beforehand on Star Wars figures. So I know I often in the field only have a real small window to make certain images. so I get the lighting situations right on Yoda and Hammerhead. They're good stand-ins for salamanders. The egg masses that they lay often stand out in this really extraordinary relief from the background of moss or leaves, this time in a private pond in Augusta County. In this image, multiple egg masses can be seen just below the surface of a small rock-lined vernal pool in the George Washington National Forest, this time in Rockingham County. And here's a detail underwater. In this video, wood frog tadpoles swim in great numbers in front of a backdrop of spotted salamander eggs. And I'll talk a little bit later on about some of the relationships that develop between other types of creatures and these egg masses, including things like predation. These egg masses can be really, really otherworldly and beautiful in a very abstract sort of way. When illuminated directly, they appear as tiny worlds edged with these delicate blue halos. Numerous creatures prey on spotted salamander egg masses. These include eastern newts, like the ones you see here, wood frog tadpoles, and even insects like caddisfly larvae, looking very alien here. Predators and prey have co-evolved to take full advantage of these ephemeral ponds. Some creatures make use of egg masses as a kind of staging ground for predation. Resembling diminutive anemones, freshwater hydras can latch on to the surfaces, such as these egg masses, where they feed on other minuscule creatures, such as copepods and seed shrimp. Recent research has demonstrated that while hydras may be killed, they do not die of old age. I love learning about these other creatures along the way. They're such fascinating life histories. And of course, watching the embryos develop here can also be fascinating. As a spotted salamander embryo develops inside an individual egg, photosynthetic algae also grow inside the egg capsule. This gradually alters the color balance to a vibrant yellow-green. Within the egg capsule, the algae help to provide oxygen. Researcher Ryan Kearney has discovered that the algae even grow inside the living cells of the embryo, a first discovery for a vertebrate species. What this new algae relationship means is still an active source of research, but seems to involve a shift from photosynthesis to a kind of fermentation reaction. And how that benefits or harms the creatures, like the algae, what do the algae get out of it? That's still open for some research and debate. So understanding the science starts to change what you perceive in these environments. Those bright green shades are not only visually striking, they're an indication of an ancient sort of relationship. And there are other kind of interesting natural history things to note in these eggs too. For example, these are all spotted salamander eggs, but the one on the far left is opaque, whereas most of these are transparent. Of course, as a photographer, the transparent ones are a lot more fun to photograph, but why is this? One theory is that the clear egg mass is better for algae development because of the photosynthesis, whereas the opaque version might be better for resisting predation. So there may be evolutionary reasons for both of these, and it's kind of a test case out in nature to see what happens. With periodic trips back to the pools, you might encounter larvae that are just about ready to hatch. Here you can see the algae starting to slough away, and then a larva in the process of leaving its egg capsule. Once they leave their egg capsule, they kind of shoot down to the bottom of the pool and look like this. Golden eyes, speckled appearance. They're trying to stay hidden under the leaf litter during the day. Now, this is a salamander that I have rather limited experience with, but I thought I'd throw it into this slideshow because I did just a little bit of work over my sabbatical from EMU. So maybe salamanders live outside of the Shenandoah Valley, near the coast. During my sabbatical, I traveled to Newport News and met up with a Virginia State herpetologist and an intern to explore a ponds complex there. Later, I traveled with that same intern to another pond surrounded by subdivisions. It was really surreal to witness a number of these fairly rare, maybe salamanders, swing around surrounded by the trappings of suburbia. We were just out in this pond and there were suburban houses all around us. So I hope to have a chance to explore these salamanders in the future. They're really quite elegant and a very different sort of environment than what I'm used to right here in the valley. Frogs. So another type of obligate species, wood frog adults, can freeze nearly solid in the winter months with a kind of natural antifreeze that keeps their internal organs from crystallizing. Wood frogs are typically the first frogs to emerge in early spring. They're explosive breeders, sometimes filling an entire section of a pond with thousands and thousands of eggs, like what you see here. I found this wood frog resting on a spotted salamander egg mass in a vernal pool. It seemed very uninterested in me and allowed me to approach quite close to make this image. Kind of felt like it was resting on a cloud. As wood frog tadpoles hatch, they nibble at algae, covering the egg masses they've left behind before turning their appetites to nearby spotted salamander eggs. Over the course of months, I've observed hungry wood frog tadpoles scouring a small pool down to the bare rock. From above the surface, wood frog tadpoles can look small and dark and nondescript, but when viewed with a light at close range, the intricate golden filigree pattern of their skin becomes apparent. Facultative species. So these are species that use vernal pools to breed or hunt, but don't require them. So in addition to vernal pool locations, these species can be found in other environments, such as permanent ponds and river shallows. Eastern newts are ubiquitous presents in Appalachian forests. Their skin contains toxin that makes them unpalatable to predators, including fish. Another study of locomotion by my friend Dave. Just love to see their twisting motion in the water. Their toxic nature allows them to live in permanent ponds and rivers as well as in vernal pools. They also have a fascinating life cycle. So after courtship, their eggs hatch into aquatic larvae. But if the conditions are right, these newts enter a terrestrial stage in which they transform into bright orange, round-tailed red Fs. And if you ever see a salamander just wandering around during the daytime, this is probably what you're seeing. That orange is an indication of toxicity to their predators. So when other salamanders are safely tucked away under cover objects during the day, these guys, on a moist day, are just wandering around through the forest. My friend Dave actually studied dorsal spot patterns in the red F stage in western New York State. Such a great photographic study, and he actually found that the average was 9 spots, in case you ever want to know. Four-toed salamanders live in mossy wetlands that may include the edge of vernal pools. I've found them living near natural pools and next to constructed water holes, as well as wet areas at the base of mountain seeps. Females deposit eggs in the moss, and the embryos develop in this moist but still terrestrial environment. Here's something really interesting about four-toed salamanders: their bellies. So they have these bright white bellies that are punctuated with dark spots, making them really easy to distinguish from other kinds of salamanders. Also cover a few common facultative frog species. like the spring peepers shown here. Their Latin name, crucifer, comes from the X-shaped marking on their back. While peepers are common and loud, their small size and earth-tone bodies can make them very difficult to actually locate. If you've ever had the experience of looking for peepers, you can have thousands of them surrounding you, and finding one can take a long time. Their piercing call is a sure sign of spring in the eastern US. In the video that follows, you can hear one peeper beginning to call while American toads are trilling in the background. I've visited vernal pools where thousands of peepers have been calling at once. The noise is deafening, and you can feel the vibrations, kind of like electricity in your body. I've literally taken lawnmower earmuffs and worn them out in the field so I don't go deaf. So much energy in a tiny little package. And this is in Augusta County also. Just impossible to do it justice with the sound system, but thousands of peepers here. You just feel it in your body. Tiny northern cricket frogs are another type of facultative species. They feature cryptic coloring that helps them to blend in with leaves and moss. While I might not spot them immediately, dozens will dart into the water as I skirt the edges of one of my favorite sinkhole vernal pool complexes, which happens to be Maple Flats, just down the road. Green frogs and bullfrogs are common species that may also be found at vernal pools. Green frogs are summer breeders. They have a distinctive banjo-like twang for their call. While green frogs might look similar to bullfrogs at first glance, here's how you can tell them apart. Their dorsolateral ridge, which is a fancy word for the raised skin just beyond the eye, extends almost to the back of their legs. In bullfrogs, this ridge ends just beyond the tympanum, also known as the ear membrane. The bullfrog is the largest frog species in North America. It's found in a wide variety of habitats. They're native to the eastern United States, but were introduced to the American West, where they're now considered to be invasive. So this takes us just a little bit away from vernal pools, but a few years back, our youngest daughter created a backyard pond for us as a high school project. She dug it by hand with a shovel, and we went from having one species, which was American toads, to having 8 species within the course of about 2 years. So now every summer, we go out to the pond and watch things happen. That's my daughter Maggie's sketchbook. She's been doing a very careful record of all the frogs she sees there and the relationships. She has names for them all. American toads breed in vernal pools, rivers, permanent ponds, and even puddles. In our backyard, the high-pitched trilling calls of male toads competing to breed can be heard through much of the spring, as you'll hear in the next video. My favorite part about that is actually seeing the visible frequency of its call in the water. I love it too, that you can see them sort of gathering up their energy for that call. And that leads to this, called amplexus in frogs. The males are like little backpacks on the great big females. This time, this is in a riverine environment in the North Fork of the Shenandoah. Females lay large strings of eggs, which hatch into extremely small tadpoles. Development time is relatively quick, and the little toadlets will soon roam the forest floors. Invertebrates. So vernal pool invertebrates include crustaceans. We've seen some of those already, like copepods and fairy shrimp. And you saw this one in the video. I thought it'd be worth coming back to. So seed shrimp, also known as ostracods, are here, a type of crustacean. Here they're photographed in front of a single wood frog egg. So that gives you a sense of their really tiny scale. Daphnia are named after the mythological nymph Daphne, who was turned into a laurel tree after an unwanted pursuit from the god Apollo. Also known as water fleas, these tiny animals feature antennae resembling branches, and they have translucent bodies, just millimeters long. Really beautiful creatures. Look like little floating jewels. And of course, there are many types of insects in vernal pools. In the video, I mentioned a number of larvae that complete their life cycle: dragonfly larvae, beetle larvae. There are diving beetles and water boatmen. Some animals live as adults, some just complete their life cycles as part of the vernal pool process. And they can also be voracious predators, sometimes attacking tadpoles or young larvae. Okay, I wanted to point out just a few resources if you're continuing to be interested in this topic, and of course I'll take questions too. So if you want to know more, you can go to my website, stephendavidjohnson.com, or if you want to download our free PDF about this topic, nampa.org/handbooks. Either place will get you there eventually. The book includes a lot more about the photography, so if you're interested in how I made these images, a bit about underwater photography and the equipment and lighting that I use, that's all in the book. And these are a couple of my students from EMU I took out in the field. The book also contains a section about conservation. Some of that was authored by my friend Mike in the audience. There are many threats to vernal pools right now. That includes things like wetland development. I mentioned industrial pipelines. Climate change is another factor. Mike's told me that back in the day, a few decades ago, he could almost predict down to the day when there was going to be a big night when all the spring breeders would come out at once. And there might be hundreds or even thousands of them. That's all changed. It's very fragmentary now. So that's one thing that climate change has already done. It's made the weather less predictable. It's made the pools less predictable. Also, amphibian diseases have affected both frogs and salamanders. Some of you may be familiar that we've actually had a ban on most salamander species as part of the pet trade in the last few years to try to cut down on that infection. Finally, a series of website resources that you might find helpful. You're welcome to screenshot that, or you can download the book, and that includes those resources too. So if you want to know more in particular about regional vernal pool resources, lots of great stuff here, including things like protocols for disinfecting gear. So when I go out to different pools and different watersheds, I use a bleach solution on my waders, about 10%, to make sure I'm not transmitting disease. Another resource you see here, the Virginia Herpetological Society. It's a great collection of enthusiasts who love everything related to snakes, salamanders, and frogs. If you want to know about any species that are here in Virginia, great resource. I hope this presentation has inspired you to explore the remarkable world of vernal pools, and I'll be glad to take any questions. Thank you.
Not sure if I can get to everybody with a microphone, but I'll try so that our audience online can hear us too.
Is the time that the egg is laid to the time that they're land-worthy salamander, is that about the same as a tadpole?
I would say usually a little bit quicker. Well, it depends a bit on the species, so, and the tadpole, I guess. So toad tadpoles are very quick, but there are certain other species, like bullfrogs, can actually overwinter, sometimes overwinter multiple seasons. So if you've ever seen a bullfrog tadpole that's huge, it's probably stayed in that pond for a couple of years. That's not usually the case with salamanders. Usually they hatch earlier, although there are some cases of certain types of salamanders who will stay in a kind of juvenile stage where they can reach sexual maturity, but they look like juveniles. So there's all sorts of exceptions in this world. It really depends on the species.
Another question back here.
Do you have any tips for someone who wanted to construct a vernal pool?
So you happen to have probably one of the best experts in the US on that topic right here, which is Mike Hazlett. Mike, do you mind fielding that question?
Sure, Steve. Yes, it can be done. And in particular, it's a useful process to replace a lost pool. Because the salamanders are so long-lived, they often will persist in an area long after their natural breeding pool has been destroyed. So you can replace that facility and get them back into the business of reproduction. So it's very doable. It can be complicated at times, and so it's good to have someone who can help through that process. It often depends on the circumstances. You would sort of design something expressly for the scenario based on what the needs are and what the composition of the animals are in that area, because that area is all around Virginia. So yes, very doable, and probably a very, very important technique going into the future with the uncertainty for these pools, replacing, augmenting, enhancing. So I would encourage you to do that and get someone to help you. I'd be happy to.
And that begs the question, how long do salamanders live?
Yeah, I mean, it really, again, depends on the species. I mean, some of the longer lived vernal pool salamanders can live up to a couple decades. Hellbenders, which we've got not too far from here, can live quite a bit longer than that. Some of the largest salamander species, I think, can live up to 70 years or more.
What happens to all the little fairy shrimp and all that kind of thing when the pools dry up?
Yeah, so they don't have long lives. Yeah, they live for a season and that's it. Their eggs, though, as I mentioned, can survive when they're dried up and can be resurrected when there's water or taken by waterfowl somewhere else.
I've actually seen them living in puddles on the road. So I guess that must have been because waterfowl visited there and plopped a few eggs in there, and not enough vehicles went through there to splash the puddle dry.
Right.
Other questions?
I've always heard that amphibian and salamanders in particular are good indicators of the environment. Would you say the populations are healthy, or how would you describe that for, say, our area?
Yeah, in some ways it's a hard question to answer because, you know, what scientists refer to as shifting baseline syndrome. I mean, whatever's come before us in the last, generation is kind of what we think of as being normal. So even for me and for Mike, we have a few years between us, that baseline is a little bit different. I mean, I would say since I've started doing this project, I haven't noticed significant shifts, but that's a very small study area. Certain types of species around the world have been decimated by amphibian fungal diseases. So there's really an amphibian crisis worldwide.
Do you have any advice for ethically going out and exploring some of these vernal pools?
Yeah. Okay, so as one thing, as I mentioned, if I'm actually setting foot in a pool, I'm disinfecting gear. I think a big thing is just paying lots of attention, watching where you step. If I'm out on a rainy night, I'm walking like this with a flashlight because anything could be underfoot. So developing your observation skills. When I can, in the smaller pools, I actually just work from the shore. I'll perch on a rock, dip my camera in the water. That's not always possible. So when I'm in the pools, I'm, again, just scanning with my flashlight, moving very slowly and deliberately. I think a lot of it's getting to know your subject, too. How do they react to you? Where are they likely to be?
Being a caver for more than 50 years, I'm curious, have you ever been underground to some of the, I don't know if we'd call them vernal pools in caves, but we do have life in some of these pools, and I'm thinking about one specific cave not far from here, Madison Saltpeter, which was recently acquired by the Cave Conservancy of Virginia, so it's owned by cavers. It's next to Grand Caverns, and there is a species-specific isopod that was identified to one of the pools in there. It's very, very rare, but have you ever thought about going into the true dark and continuing your research?
Yes, and I have. Actually looking for an isopod. On that particular trip, I didn't find it all. I found a lot of other interesting invertebrates. I would love to spend some time with cave salamanders, too. So you have some connections? I'd love to have your card and do some more cave work in the future.
I'll give you my card.
Excellent.
Any other questions for Steve? I'm sure he'd be happy to stick around and chat with folks individually if you'd like to come up afterwards. And join me in thanking one more time Steve for his presentation tonight.
Thanks so much.